What's up, everyone? One of the most common questions that I get from customers on Bonsaify.com is, should I pot up the trees that I got from you? In other words, if it's out of season, should I slip pot them? Well, the answer to that question is not 100% yes or no. There's a number of different scenarios that we can go through to kind of examine what happens if you want to slip pot. Now, in case you're not familiar with the term slip potting, essentially what that means is that we are going to, without doing any root work, pull the tree out of one container and stick it into another container, usually a larger one, because if you can't do any root work, you are not going to be able to put it into a smaller container. Obviously, part of the problem with starters can be that, just like this one, this one's relatively top heavy, and so just sitting in a 3-inch container, it's going to be very prone to falling over. And in a nursery setting, we have these in flats, and that means that they get sort of support from the sides so that they don't fall over. But once they're sent out to you guys, that problem is a little bit more prevalent. Now, I've pulled this out, and as you can see, there's a relatively full root ball here. I'm doing this in the middle of summer. It's late July right now, and I don't want to really mess with these roots too much. But there are a couple things to keep in mind. You want to leave the majority of the roots alone if you're slip potting, but you can do a little bit of root work. So the roots that are on the bottom tend to be the most important in terms of the health of the tree, whereas the ones that are up here near the surface can be somewhat less important in terms of the health of the tree. And I should say that if you're going to do slip potting, the most important thing to remember is that make a note, like stick a tag in the pot or something like that if you have a lot of trees, that it's very important that you actually come back and do the proper root work later in the season or in the spring of the following year. And that's because if you don't do the proper root work in order to create a good nabari, you are not going to have a nice looking tree. So that's probably about all I really want to do in terms of combing out. I'm going to cut off a few of these long roots that are circling up here near the top. And then everything else, I'm just going to leave until next time. So I'm going to set this aside and look at a couple other examples, and then we'll come back to putting them in the containers later. As opposed to the black pine, this little Itoigawa is not very old, not very big. And if you're not sure, so there's no reason to slip pot this, but I just want to use it to demonstrate some of the downsides of slip potting. So if I kind of tip this over and tap out soil, you'll see that there's not really any roots here in the upper section. And so all that soil just kind of falls out. And if I continue tapping, more soil falls out. So the bottom line is that the roots have not actually solidified around the soil in the sense that they are holding the root ball together so that slip potting becomes actually a thing. So essentially now, because all of the soil has fallen away from this, I'm doing a full repot, sort of. I'm not going to cut any of the roots, but this is going to be more stressful to your plant than if the root ball remains intact. Essentially, the surface of these root tips are covered in fine hairs, and even though you can't really see them, those hairs get damaged during this type of operation. Let me set this aside and look at one more example. So this is a Texas Cedar Elm that's been in here, I believe, less than a year. So somewhere in between the other two. There's enough roots at the bottom here to kind of hold the root ball together, but not quite as solid up at the top. I'm not going to trim any roots. I'm literally just using my finger to kind of like take off the loose soil on the top. All right, and one more quite different example, that is this 3x9 Anderson band. Now, we use these to grow trees that we are going to pot up into larger containers, and the growth that you get in a container like this is a lot more robust than something that you get in just like a little 3-inch that's basically less than half the size as you would expect. So the advantage in terms of the growing operation is fantastic. The disadvantage is that these do not stand up once you take them out of the flats that they are meant to be kept in. They're called bands because they have a cross-shaped set of bands on the bottom to retain the soil but also allow the roots to escape at the corners. So there's a band of plastic there and there, but the corners are open. So when there's not a lot of soil in here, the soil will actually fall straight out of the bottom if you take it out of the flat. But this one has plenty of roots. So knowing that this has quite a few roots, I can actually pull it out of here. But before I do that, I want to think to myself, is that actually accomplishing what I want to accomplish with this plant? We grow this particular tree is one of our black pines for exposed root and root over rock, meaning we've grown it in this container to create longer roots so that you guys can then bare root that during repotting season, put it over a rock, or slowly bare root the portion and exposing the roots so that you can make an exposed root. With the exposed root, you might actually just want to cut off the band on the bottom. So I'm taking a pair of scissors here and just cutting through the sides of that cross piece. So now I've removed the cross piece there and I have a full open bottom here. So rather than slip potting this, if I were going to make an exposed root tree, I would want to basically just nestle this on top of a larger container. So the idea here is basically just to stabilize this by attaching it to a larger container. If you don't want to use guy wires like this to attach it to the container, you can actually just bury the bottom third or half of this into a large container, something larger than this, like a 3-gallon or 5-gallon container of some sort. Now, over time with exposed root, I'll just cut off like say 1 inch or 2 of the top of this after the roots have run into the bottom container. But rather than slip potting for this particular scenario, this is actually a better solution. If you're going to slip pot, it would be much like the other examples that I've shown. So with this Itoigawa that I pulled out and where it was completely bare rooted essentially because the soil was not solidified between the roots, all I'm going to do is basically take these roots and nestle it into a larger container. Now, there's a video on this channel about putting trees into larger containers for the purposes of faster growth. And so, as you might imagine, if you're familiar with growing plants, the larger container is going to increase the growth rate. And that might not happen immediately, but eventually this tree is going to be growing faster because it has more resources to draw on here in this gallon container than it did in the 3-inch container. So I've put this formerly 3-inch black pine into a 3-gallon container, and this is a felt grow bag. I've used a hole punch to just make some attachment points for my wire. Then I've really firmly packed the soil around the edges of the container because they're soft. It gives a little bit of give on those types of guy wires. You can use chopsticks to firm it up if you want, or do nothing at all, but I wanted to make sure that the top of this didn't move so the tree doesn't fall out of the container. Over time, those roots will kind of solidify it in there and I can just take off this wire. But in terms of slip potting, this can be really productive in terms of protecting the tree from summer conditions and that sort of stress that trees get if they don't have enough resources. So for the rest of the summer, I'll leave this in here. Now, like I said before, I didn't actually do any root work and to the bottom of the 3-inch container, and that means that there's all those circling roots on the bottom. And as the tree gets bigger, those are going to get bigger and they're going to get harder and harder to deal with. So we want to come back and essentially pull this out in spring, ideally in the next repotting window, do the proper root work after you've done this during the growing season, and then put it back into a container like this again. That is going to slow it down again, In other words, it's going to speed up because it's in a 3-gallon container, and then cutting off all those roots is going to slow it down a little bit. But if you don't do the root work, then you're not going to have a good looking nabari, and that's really important, at least on a pine tree. So some species are very sensitive to root work. A cork oak comes to mind, and many oaks can be, depending on the time of the year. Just keep in mind that slip potting can be stressful for the plant, and so if you live in a climate where the summers are really hot or the conditions are really hot during the time that you're doing this, provide some protection for the plant afterwards for a couple of weeks. That wraps up this video. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.